Hi, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all very well and enjoying your new centre. Thank you for having me today, Nick. Nick's just asked me to come along and talk to the group about funding care, funding long-term care. It's an area that I work in quite a lot in my day job. So I'm a SOLLA accredited financial planner. So for those of you that haven't heard of SOLLA, it stands for the Society of Later Life Advisors. And basically, anybody that's a SOLLA accredited advisor goes through quite a rigorous assessment process because it's very focused on later life, potentially vulnerable situations and vulnerable clients. So it does take quite a lot of extra work in terms of more focus on understanding later life issues and the softer skills that are required and needed to be able to work effectively in that area. So I did my SOLA accreditation many years ago now, and every 5 years I renew it. So in my day job, I've come across a lot of situations where people worry about the cost of care, and rightly so, because it can be quite an expensive part of later years. And it's a bit of an unknown cost as well, because none of us ever really know how long we're going to end up paying it for, and if care needs become progressively worse on that journey. So it can cause an awful lot of stress with the uncertainty and the difficulty attached to, trying to make a plan for that and to try and feel quite settled and secure about a situation, because anything can happen really, and sometimes a crisis might be thrown into the mix, and it can add a lot more stress and worry to people who are looking after and caring for loved ones. So today I'm here to just talk to you about, the different options that people generally consider when it comes to funding care when they get to that stage. Excellent. So yes, thank you, Nick, for having me along today. Just to have a little talk about how people can think about funding long-term care when it's such an uncertain time for people, really. I think without a doubt, the most common questions that I'm continually asked in this area really is, people are concerned about worrying, is the money going to run out? How much is it going to cost? I hear so often, I don't want all my money going on care because I want to leave some money for loved ones. People might have a bit of insecurity about, am I going to have to sell my home to be able to fund my care? And often our homes are where we feel safe and secure, and we might like to stay there, for the longer term. And there's always a concern about the home having to be sold just because a care need has arisen. And also, I guess people worry about, like, what about any inheritance tax? Like if I have a problem with maybe having to pay some inheritance tax, how can I reduce the amount of inheritance tax I might have to pay when I die, but without the worry of not having enough money to pay for care. And then when it comes to things like having a lasting power of attorney in place, people try to understand what the role and responsibility is for them when they're acting as attorney. It's not always the case, but quite often carers might be the attorney for the person that they care for. So it's quite important for them to know the rules about, the parameters around spending the money, spending the cared for person's money. And, if they want to make some gifts or if they want to fund a potential care need, how that should be managed, really. So there's all sorts of emotion that goes on along with the practical and the financial. And I think all of that together can cause quite a lot of overwhelm for people when they're trying to deal with the situation of thinking about care and the care needs, especially if things move quite quickly, because that can be the case at times. I love this this lovely lady. I love this slide, but I've had this slide for quite a long time actually. But it is, I smile each time I look at it, but it is quite relevant because according to the Office of National Statistics, 1 in 3 babies born today will live to see their 100th birthday. And that is quite a big reality now because we do have an aging population. And I see it in my job. My oldest client was just under 103 when she passed. And I've had, quite a few of those as well. So it's quite relevant in the sense that, we are obviously living longer, and that's great news. And medical technology has moved on so much, which is probably keeping us all alive for longer as well. But it does actually mean that we are more likely to be living with more complicated health and more chronic health conditions because we are getting older. And that does bring more challenge to our state of health as we age, really. So it's quite important when thinking about planning that we don't, I mean, it's amazing when I speak to clients about longevity. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's always a very real discussion. And often people will think, oh, I won't live that long, but actually it's quite a reality now. So, it is sensible to plan towards that as well. So I just put that in because it is quite relevant, not just because of how old we might all get to and how we might all age, but it's the journey that we will go through to get there as well. And, lots of people live at home and have complex health conditions, but they have very successful care arrangements at home and they like to keep it that way. And if care needs get progressively worse, then they just increase the care and the support that they have to make sure those needs continue to be met. So life expectancy is very important, not just for the age we get to, but also because it just highlights the fact that our care needs, or sorry, our care journeys might look quite different and might carry on for quite a long time. I've just put a few points here for some important legal considerations. And I think you'll be aware of these because you're part of Sutton Carers Centre. But it's really, really important, if you haven't already done this, to please speak to the person you care for and make sure that there's a lasting power of attorney put in place. So that basically gives an individual the legal authority to manage their property and their financial affairs, or their health and welfare, or both. If it gets to a situation where the person being cared for doesn't want to manage their own affairs anymore, or can't for whatever reason, or might struggle with some challenge on their cognition. So if there's no lasting power of attorney in place, nobody will have the legal authority. Even if they're a next of kin, that doesn't mean the same thing by any means. So if you haven't already done this, please make sure you do act on it quickly, because it does take 3 to 4 months to put those in place. And if they need to be used, they have to be registered with the Office of Public Guardian before they're used. I put on the enduring power of attorney on there because up until 2007, that was the form, the legal form that was required to be able to act for the person in terms of their property and financial affairs. And the law changed after that, but enduring power of attorney are still valid if they haven't been revoked. The lasting power of attorney is what took over, and now you can also have, as well as the property and finance, you can have the health and welfare one. And I think both of them are equally as important because they do different things. The property and finance will allow an attorney to manage the property and financial affairs. But the health and welfare is really important because that's to do with the cared for person's wishes about whether they want to be at home and have care at home, or whether they would have a preference to be in a care home, or what type of care and support that they would need and what their wishes would be. So that's really important to have that in place and to have that discussion. It's not always easy to discuss things like the finances or the health and welfare, when people are getting to a stage where it's quite important to get things in place. But it is really important to do that, to make sure that the cared for person's wishes continue to be followed and addressed, as far as possible and as far as sensibly possible, really. And I also put on there a will review, because sometimes, well, it's quite common for any situation, really, but wills should be updated on a fairly regular basis, especially if circumstances can change. And sometimes wills that might have been done, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, if they haven't been reviewed since, there might be some elements in the will that don't really make as much sense now, or legal changes might have happened in the meantime, which means that it might not be as effective as it was initially set out to be. So I think, so long as the person has mental capacity, a will review is always a good idea, so long as it's not been reviewed for some time, and just sensible to get the later life affairs in order, really. So with the lasting power of attorney, they can be done online, and you can do them for yourself, and you can just do them online and pay the court fee to get them registered. All I would say is, if you have a particular challenging situation, or the cared for person has a challenging situation, or maybe some tension among the family or among siblings, it might be a good idea to use the services of a qualified solicitor in this area to be able to help with that, to make sure it's set up properly with the correct attorneys in place to be able to manage the affairs for the loved one. I think it's great to do things online. It's great to do things as much as you can for yourself and try and avoid professional fees where it's possible. But if a situation is a little bit more complicated, I think it's advice worth paying for, to make sure that no misunderstandings occur and everything is set up accurately and correctly, to avoid any potential tension or issue further down the line. I deal with a lot of lovely situations in my job, but unfortunately I see a lot of contentious issues as well. So I feel quite strongly that certain things should be reviewed and put in place, and make sure everything is up to date, to try and avoid those things in the future. Because often, if it involves a lot of tension, it usually means it's a lot of financial, costly issues as well. So it's not, I wouldn't advise that. So in terms of the options to fund care, there's a few options, really. But generally, I think a combination of these options generally works best, really. And a lot of it will depend on what the situation is, in terms of the individual, what have they got in the way of, like, their home, any savings, any investments, like what their financial situation looks like, really. And that will define how many options that might be available to that individual. But nobody wants the money to run out. The individual that, needs the care doesn't want the money to run out, and the care provider doesn't either, because that makes it a really difficult situation if you're in a contract with a care provider to get care at home or care in a care home, and then all of a sudden the money runs down really quickly, and it's quite a difficult conversation to have if the care provider wasn't aware of the level of finances that the individual has. And that's why, if anybody has been doing any research or has, explored options with care providers or care home placements, don't be surprised if you're asked the question very early in: how much money have you got? How much money has the individual got to pay for their care? Because the care provider likes to feel secure that there's at least, 2, maybe 3 years of money there to be able to fund care. And if the care provider has a good relationship with the local authority, or they have a contract with the local authority. If it's a care home, they might be able to come to some sort of agreement when the money runs down to that threshold level of the 23,250, that the local authority might provide some financial support to help meet those gaps. So savings is really just cash in the bank, any deposit savings or national savings and investments, premium bonds, that type of thing. Investments might be if the individual, for example, has stocks and shares ISAs or different investment plans that they might have taken out over the years. And I will go through these in a bit more detail from the next slide on. Care plans and care annuities. You might not have heard of what these are, but I will explain it as we go through the slides. And then using the property that the cared for person lives in, if that's a property that they have title to, so a property that they own. But often I find it's a combination of all of the above that would be used to fund care, along with the income, like state pension or any other pension income that the individual has. The savings option, there's pros and cons to all these options. And it always comes back to what the individual's situation is, really. So in terms of the savings, it's good because your capital's not at risk, because so long as you're within the £85,000 with each banking license that you might have, your capital won't be at risk. So that's obviously a good thing. And, the cash can be available. It can be used to support any care cost along with income. And then depending on how long that lasts, there may be money left over, which can pass to the family when the individual passes. But of course, the downside for savings is the interest rate, the bank base rate reduced again last week, and we're expecting another reduction in the coming months, really. So although at the moment there's probably an average interest rate of about 4.5% still, it will be reducing more as time goes on. So that's I guess that's a risk, really. And then of course the disadvantage of the running out of money, because it's not going to be an open-ended pot at some point, depending on how much is being paid out of it for care and how long the care journey lasts. That might run out quite quickly. And then inflation has a factor as well. We're all very aware, I'm sure, of how bad inflation has been in recent years. Thankfully, it's under much more control now, but the cost of living is still, that bit too high, really. But with savings, it's hard for savings to keep up with inflation when inflation does have a lot of period of time where it's up and down quite a lot. So that's something to be careful on. So our second option is the investments. And this is really, like I mentioned, individuals might have had a lot of investment plans in the past. Maybe they've taken out different ISAs over a period of time, or general investment accounts. And of course, the advantage to them really is, it's good to have the cash available and to sell down the investments to fund the care. Generally speaking, I say this really carefully, but generally speaking, over the longer term, investments do generate a better return than cash. But when I say longer term, I mean 5-10 years plus, really. And I guess with investments, any money that's left over, similar to cash, can pass to the family, or the beneficiaries of the will, I should say. But in terms of the disadvantages, with investment, you've got to be so careful, because when your money's invested, it is, prone to that investment risk. And I don't think it'll have escaped anybody's attention, all of the hoo-ha about the tariffs and the US and everything going on there. Thankfully, things have recovered, but 6 weeks ago when all of that started, there was a lot of nervous people with investment plans and the markets dropping. And the markets did go down a little bit, but probably not as much as people thought, really, because some of the sensational headlines made it a lot more scary for individuals because they just kind of absorbed such negativity out of that news. But, it is important if you are invested that you have a risk that you're comfortable with and that it's not positioned too high, because with high risk, although you might do well when things are good, it's also a harder fall when things go down. So with investments, there's still that risk of running out of money, depending how long the care journey lasts and how much you're paying out for that, really. And with inflation, if markets go down and inflation is high, it can be difficult to make a decent return in those time periods. So it's just looking at what's right, the pros and cons of each, really, to see what feels right. Care plans, this is confusing now with the terminology, because care plans in my world of being a regulated advisor mean a care annuity, but I understand in your world it's a care plan, with a care plan when it's in place for a loved one to address their needs and make it very clear what those needs are. So these providers that provide these care annuities are a nuisance because they won't call them the same thing, and it makes it very confusing for people. But basically, what a care annuity does is it's designed to bridge that shortfall in the cost of care that you pay for against how much state pension and any other pension a cared for person might be getting. So, say, for example, I'm just going to keep a really blunt example here, just to explain it. But say, for example, if an individual was getting 12 grand a year for state pension, and if they were paying out for care, say at 50 grand a year, that would mean that the shortfall is £38,000 a year. So the care plan is designed to be able to pay that £38,000 a year to the care provider. So how it's set up is the cared for person would pay a lump sum on day one to the insurance company to say, okay, I need £38,000 a year covered to pay my care. How much will that cost? And the insurance company they call it an underwriting process. That's basically where they look to see, they look at the situation, the individual's age, their care and support needs, and if there's any medical conditions or underlying health or any diagnosis. And to be blunt, really what they're looking at is, okay, if we're going to pay out this £38,000 a year, we want to know how long we think we're going to end up paying that for before we decide how much we're going to charge for it. So the insurance companies write to the individual's GP to get that report with their consent or the consent of the power of attorney. And they also write to the care provider, whether that's a care provider that gives home care, or if it's a care home placement, it would be to the care home, and get the care manager to provide the report based on the care and support needs. And then the insurance company will do their numbers and come back and say how much they would charge to put that care plan in place, or that annuity in place. And you can have two different types. You can have one that starts straight away, or you can have which is called the immediate care plan, or you can have a deferred care plan, which means that it's a care plan set up, but it doesn't start until some point within the next 5 years. Those deferred care plans are less popular because usually when people have the need, they like to take out the immediate care plan, because the deferred care plan doesn't start for whatever they decide between 1 and 5 years. That might be for somebody who has a diagnosis and they know it's going to reduce their mobility, and they have a fairly good they've got a fairly good idea of how their care journey is going to look in the next couple of years. So it might be cheaper for them to take it out now, and then the plan starts, say, for example, in year 2. But the care plan, the care insurance provider would send the money directly to the care provider each month. and it's paid tax-free when it's paid to a care provider who's registered with the Care Quality Commission. So it's a lump sum on day one. And I can't tell you what that lump sum is because it's very individual to everybody. And it's because it's based on their underwriting process with the GP and with the care provider. So everybody has a different cost in terms of their annuity. Um, but the good thing about it is it guarantees to pay for that monthly cost for the rest of the individual's life. And even if the insurance company got into financial difficulty, it's still fully protected because it's protected under the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which is good news. It can be a bit tricky because paying a lump sum out of your bank account on day one can feel like, oh my gosh, I'm paying out this lump sum. What if the loved person doesn't live beyond this time? We don't reach the break-even point. So you can build in a bit of protection on the capital. So God forbid, if the cared for person passed in the earlier stages, there would be some element of capital coming back to that, coming back to their estate. And also with escalation, so care providers will increase their fees every year. Generally, it's higher than the inflationary amount because care tends to have higher increases. So you can actually have those added on to the annuity. So each year after the first anniversary, the annuity could increase maybe 5 or 6%, whatever you would decide it to be. So it's quite good in terms of giving it some kind of certainty that at least that shortfall is covered for the rest of the individual's life. And if they decide, say, for example, if the person was getting care at home to start with, but then for whatever reason it was recommended that they had to move into a care home, then the care annuity can move with them. So it's quite flexible in that sense. It seems expensive on day one because you're paying for it up front, but it gives a good sense of peace of mind. And again, it's like similar to the other options, it does depend on what the individual's financial position is like. Some situations, an individual might not be able to afford a care annuity and they might just have to use any savings that they have or any investments. And sometimes people might have, quite a lot of value in their home, or they might have quite a bit in investments and they can afford to ring fence that money and buy an annuity. And then they have the peace of mind that there should be some beneficiary money left over then once the care journey is kind of looked after, really, in terms of being paid for once the plan is in place. So in terms of the advantages, it secures the shortfall in the care cost, which is a nice peace of mind factor. There's no capital risk to it because you're fully protected, even God forbid if something happens with the insurance company. And it's good that increases can be put in there as well. So it kind of covers off that annual increase from the care provider and not having to worry about where to get the money from to fund them. And the income is paid to the care provider tax-free. And that's because they will be registered with the Care Quality Commission. And I guess really for families, they like it because it tends to ring fence the care costs. So then hopefully there would still be some beneficiary money left when they can ring fence the care costs. But of course, the disadvantages would be the money spent on day one. And actually that can be quite expensive as well. And if the loved one, passes early and there's no capital protection purchased, it might feel like actually that was a bit of a bad choice to make, really. But I often say to families, it's a gamble for you, but it's a gamble for the insurance company as well. And nobody has a crystal ball to really work through how long individuals, would need that care annuity for, really. But it's just one of those situations that in terms of the planning, is it something that they want to secure, or are they quite happy not to secure it with the care annuity, but then understand what the options might look like in terms of any local authority funding beyond when the money runs out. The inflation is a risk in that sense as well, because annual care cost increases can be, generally they're around 5 to 6%, but they can go up as high as 8%. So it's just making sure that all of that is kind of planned sensibly for, really. So the next option then is using the property to fund care. So, you know, it's quite common really for the property to go up for sale and then the proceeds of the sale to be used to fund the care. But if you have a property that's in a desirable area for renting and the property itself is in fairly good condition, because you have to bring it up to standard to rent, and spend some money on it potentially to get it ready for the rental market. But sometimes if people move into a care home, they might decide to rent out their property to be able to get an income from it if it's in a desirable area and they can get a half decent rent for it. Because then that preserves the value of the home, and hopefully over time the property prices will increase. So sometimes people will consider that. And then another option really is thinking about equity release. Now, I say this quite carefully because to me, equity release would be the last resort. If there's savings and investments, they would be sensible to use first, really. But for people that have needs for care and really, really want to stay at home, especially if they have a really good care arrangement at home, or they have a loved one at home, or they really want to stay in their own home, they might decide to actually just take a little bit of equity out to be able to fund that gap in their care cost shortfall. So many, many years ago, equity release was a horrible, horrible product. I never, thankfully, went near it years ago, but it has changed a lot over the years. And it is quite a sensible strategy if it's looked at in a sensible way and planned for in a realistic way, really. Where I would look at equity release in my day job really would be for people that would really want to stay at home and have a really good care arrangement at home and not want to leave their home. So we would just take out a little bit as and when they need it, instead of taking out a really chunky lump sum and then paying lots of interest very quickly on it, because that's just wasted money. That's not appropriate, really. And then we have deferred payment agreements, which they're basically when the local authority will allow you to keep your home, but they will put a charge on your property. And this is usually in the situation where an individual, say if they live on their own at home and they have to go into a care home, but they don't want to sell their property, or the family don't want to sell the property. It might be sentimental reasons, or they might want to rent it out, but still need a little bit of support financially. And the local authority can have a look at that. And if the criteria is met, they could offer a deferred payment agreement. So it's basically a loan, really, and they do charge an interest for it. It's not extortionate, but it is an interest that does build up over time as well. But for people that really want to hold on to the home, but need that bit of extra financial assistance to be able to rent it out, or a bit of help in funding the care costs, it can be a very good idea. And I know with Surrey and Croydon and Sutton, like all of the local authorities will offer it if individuals meet the criteria. So it's quite important just to read through all of the information. There's a bit of cost attached to it in terms of having a valuation on the property and having it set up. It can also be very beneficial if, which has been the case actually, with the property market in the last few years especially, it can be quite difficult to sell a property in a sensible timescale. And then if the money starts to run out quite quickly and you need to get your hands on the cash and the property is very slow to sell, you might think about putting a deferred payment agreement in place with the local authority, so that the local authority can fund those care costs until the property eventually sells. Because people don't want to be under pressure to accept a really silly offer from somebody just to get the property sold, if they know that the house has a certain amount of value in it, really. Um, so there's various ways that the property can be used, really. And sometimes people don't want the hassle of the rent. They don't want the hassle of being worried about getting tenants that might not be appropriate, or, might not look after the place, like you would have done, really. Um, and equity release only really works for care at home. But it's definitely a few bits of consideration there, really. And it depends where people are on the care journey as well. Because sometimes, well, actually, quite often, I think, really, to be fair, I think because it can be quite a difficult time for people emotionally and financially, and trying to make plans with this whole world of care that people might never have had to deal with before. It can be quite hard to think about the care journey and then think about the finances at the same time. But actually, the ideal situation is to try and think about, what your needs would be like. What would you like? If that situation happened, would you like to have care at home, or would you think, no, I don't want any hassle, I just want to, not that that's hassle, but if people might say, oh, I just want to move into a care home and then I can have company and stimulation and whatever. If they live on their own, that might be their choice. But it's just a case of trying to think about it in advance if possible. I appreciate it's not an aspirational move, but it's an important one, and it's important to understand the individual's wishes, especially if they, further down the line, they get a diagnosis and their capacity is a little bit challenged. It would be nice to know what their wishes are to make sure that they could be followed as far as sensibly possible anyway. So in terms of the future of social care, my goodness, I really do wish I had a crystal ball, honestly. I've been doing this job for years, but I remember in the early days when the future of social care used to be talked about, and we had some very good work done by many people, really, and many teams, in terms of putting a cap on the cost of care. And that was music to people's ears, in terms of, oh my goodness, at least then we could plan with some element of certainty. If we know that once we reach a certain level of cap, that the local authority would be able to step in. But of course, these things have been proposed and almost got so far into the system and then pulled at the last minute, or we've had changes in government. And it's just, everything is on hold again. It's so, so frustrating. And I used to joke many years ago and say, I'll probably be retired before any of these changes come in, but I'm still a long way off retirement. But I really wish the pace would pick up and, things would be done, really. But I do believe it is a cross-party agreement that's needed, for proper, serious, long-term planning, with the NHS and with adult social care, and, consideration for how that whole system works, and consideration for families that are going through that system every single day. I think it's quite likely that care will be brought more into the communities to try and take the pressure off the NHS and that whole system, really. But in terms of anything happening, I do think it's still some way off, because any big changes are going to require lots of, consultation and legislation before things can be put in place. So it's very frustrating, because the last cap on the cost of care that was talked about, proposed and promised, was the 86,000 care cap. And I put in the slide there, not what it seemed, just to put in the point about it didn't necessarily mean that once you'd spent £86,000 on care, that you would have reached the cap, or the loved one would have reached the cap, because actually that 86,000 was only the actual cost of care. It didn't include the cost of, if you were in a care home, for example, accommodation costs, like paying for your room and the light and the heat and everything, and your meals. So for individuals reaching that cost of care, it would take them a lot longer than just spending £86,000 to reach it. So I don't know the answers. I just know that I feel very strongly that I really wish individuals and families could make a plan with some element of certainty, because I see so many horrible situations and, lots of money being spent and a system being very disjointed and under pressure. But I think the whole social care world is really under pressure as well with recruiting staff. I mean, you see the headlines on a regular basis now with all of that, but just getting the right staff in and having enough staff to be able to do those jobs as well. So it's a whole big it's a whole big political change that needs to happen, but it definitely needs cross-party agreement and everybody to just make that commitment and make that effort and find the funding to make sure that we can put it into the system and learn from other countries that have done elements of it really well and just give our loved ones the care that they deserve, so deserve after their working lives. So this is my last slide, you'll be happy to hear, but I just put this one in really in terms of, making a plan for change in care needs, because often care can start out as, just an element of care, maybe a diagnosis might trigger a little bit of care, or maybe just medical decline. There's lots of things that can happen. And I think it's quite important to be, to discuss it with the loved one. And acceptance is a tricky one there, because sometimes it takes a while for that acceptance piece to happen, really. But certainly for discussion and thinking about, okay, what could this look like for us now? Is this something we can manage with, having some care at home arrangement, or is it something that's quite likely to progress into having to consider a care placement at some point in the future? And I really think carers are amazing. I've been involved with carers in a previous charity I was a trustee for, and I'm a trustee for another charity now, where we've set up a carers cafe, because I'm so aware of the endless hours and commitment that unpaid carers give to loved ones. And I just think it's really important to make sure that often, in my experience, often I find carers feel like, well, that's my job. That's what I'm here to do. It's my duty to look after my family member or whoever it is. But actually, it's really, really important to look after your own physical and mental health as well. Because, I know you'll know about your carers assessments, and, it's all about you as well as the person you cared for. But I honestly can't emphasize that enough, because the job that you do, I know you probably wouldn't call it a job, but I should say the role that you do is such a crucial role for that individual, and making sure that they get the right care and support, and making sure that everything is in place for them. So, the last thing you want is for something to happen with you, or risk burnout because you're just doing too much because you feel like you have to, or because the demand is there with the complexity of the care situation, or the individual is not going through a very good time and you're taking the brunt of it. So just always, always, please make sure you look after your own health, mental health and well-being as well, because that's so important. And respite is really good for that as well, because, it's very hard to get a decent break from caring, as in like a period of time. It's nice to get little snippets of opportunity to go out and go for a swim, or go out for a walk, or go out and see a friend for a coffee. But, to get proper respite to hopefully recharge your batteries as well is really good. And I think as well, if it's quite likely that the individual may need a care placement, as in a care home in the future, doing respite for a couple of weeks in an area that you think might be a nice place for them, that they might feel comfortable and settled in. It could be good to do a bit of respite there, because then that's a bit of a trial period as well, without that commitment, or without that sort of harshness that people might feel like, oh gosh, I'm not moving out of my own home now and going straight in somewhere. That's such a major move to make, really, isn't it? So I think doing the research in advance is very good as well, because it's very hard to find a care placement of your choice in a time of crisis. Because if that care home didn't have a place, that's really difficult, really. So it's good to be able to do research and have a short list. And if that situation happens in the future, at least you've already done the research, because it's really, really hard to make decisions when you're overwhelmed in a time of crisis. And I know not everybody wants to be doing tons of research in these areas, but if the reality is that that might be part of what happens in the future, it is quite important to at least do a little bit of research and just try and understand what's out there, really cost wise, as well as what you get in terms of the money and how affordable these options are as well. I've had a lot of situations where people have called me up and said, "Oh yeah, I need to speak to you about funding care," and they tell me the situation. And on quite a lot of occasions, I've said to them, "Do you realize the money is going to run out in X amount of months?" And they have no idea, because they were so overwhelmed with the panic and the crisis that they couldn't separate themselves out and look at the finances as well as the decision to place the person in care at the same time. And I understand that because I've been there myself. I know what that overwhelm feels like. It's really difficult to manage it. But I guess, in terms of good quality care arrangement, and I'm a big believer in having care at home. I love it. I absolutely do. And I think it's fantastic if people can stay at home as far as possible. I do see very successful arrangements in care homes as well. So I do definitely think there's a place for both. But in terms of a good quality care arrangement, there's a huge amount of mental health benefit, with good stimulation, good activities, and, making sure that there's a good care plan in place with, 24-hour care, making sure the individual is getting their medication on time and hydrated on time to avoid UTIs and potential hospital admissions. So good quality care is really important at this stage. I don't have to tell you that. I know you'll all know that so well. I guess in terms of my tips, really, I would say definitely discuss even the difficult conversations about care needs. Personal care is really personal, isn't it? But the care needs, but also on finances. That's a really hard subject for some people, especially family members or parents having those discussions with children. But it is important as well because, it's good to understand what that person's wishes are so that you can follow them as far as possible. I know I keep talking about following a person's wishes, but I do feel very strongly about that because the person is at the heart of it all. And it's quite nice if you know what the wishes are to make sure that they are followed, so long as it's safe and sensible to do that. I would definitely have an idea on what the care journey might look like and have a couple of options so that you're not starting from absolute scratch if there's a crisis and the discharge team in the hospital is saying to you, right, come on, we need to, have your loved one discharged, and then you have to make a decision super quick, and it's very, very difficult. If the lasting power of attorney is not in place already, please, please, please do that because that's so important. It really is. You can do it yourself. You can have a little look online. If it feels really daunting or overwhelming, then you could speak to a solicitor. I work with loads of solicitors who are so good and so get this world and understand this world. And if you speak to them, they would just be so good at advising and guiding in the right sense, even with the most complicated family matters. They're very, very experienced in those areas. And then looking after your own physical and mental health really is the most important thing because without you, the loved one won't have all of this really good quality care arranged and monitored and making sure that it's all in good place and doing everything it should be doing. So yeah, but I think you're all amazing. You really are. So I hope that was helpful. But if anybody has any questions, if you're a bit shy about asking a question online, don't worry, you can send me an email and I'll answer it. It might take me a couple of days to come back to you if I'm quite busy, but if you're a bit shy about asking a question now, don't worry about it. You can send me an email, but otherwise, if you're not shy and you would like to ask a question, I'm happy to hear it.